What are you doing? Let go of me!
You are mine now. Say nothing, or you are dead.
A silver room service tray clatters to a plush carpet, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence of Suite 99. Danielle Monroe stands frozen, her eyes locked onto Choi Kyung-ho, a man whose name is whispered in fear across the city. He isn't just a guest, he is a predator standing over a fallen traitor. The clock starts now. Kyung-ho has exactly 60 seconds to decide Danielle's fate before his cleanup crew arrives. Instead of a bullet, he chooses a different kind of imprisonment. He pulls her into a crushing, possessive embrace just as the door bursts open, claiming her as his property to save her life and seal her fate. The silver room service tray clattered onto the thick Persian rug, the sound of porcelain shattering against the floor echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous silence of Suite 99. Danielle stood frozen, her fingers still curled around the phantom weight of the tray. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the expensive, woodsy scent of sandalwood cologne. Across the room, bathed in the amber glow of a crystal chandelier, stood Choi Kyung-ho. He was exactly as the tabloids described, sharp, lethal, and devastatingly handsome, but the newspapers never mentioned the coldness in his eyes that could stop a heart mid-beat. He was adjusting the cuff of a charcoal gray suit, his knuckles bruised and stained with a dark smear that Danielle knew wasn't wine. At his feet, a man lay slumped against a velvet armchair, unconscious or worse. I have the late-night order for Suite 98, Danielle stammered, her voice thin and trembling. She took a frantic step backward, her sensible work shoes crunching on a fragment of a broken saucer. The door was unlocked. I'm so sorry, I'll leave. I'm leaving right now. Before she could turn, the heavy oak door clicked shut. Kyung-ho hadn't moved, but a shadow had detached itself from the corner, one of his silent, suited guards. The lock turned with a finality that made Danielle's stomach drop. You have a very loud pulse, Danielle Monroe, Kyung-ho said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. He knew her name. He hadn't even looked at her name tag, yet he knew exactly who she was. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. Danielle backed away until the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window pressed against her spine. The lights of the city blurred behind her, thousands of people living normal lives just a few hundred feet away, completely unaware she was trapped with a monster. Kyung-ho stopped inches from her. He was significantly taller, a wall of tailored wool and lethal intent. He reached out not to strike her, but to tuck a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His fingers were ice cold. You saw his face, Kyung-ho whispered, nodding toward the man on the floor. And more importantly, you saw mine. In my world, that makes you a ghost, and ghosts don't get to walk out of doors. I won't say anything, she pleaded, her breath hitching as her savior complex warred with her instinct to flee. She thought of her sister, waiting for her to come home. I have a family. I have nothing to do with this. That changed the moment you turned the handle, he countered. He leaned in, his hand moving from her hair to the back of her neck, pulling her firmly against his chest. The contact was electric, a terrifying mix of protection and possession. You aren't going anywhere. From this second forward, your life belongs to the shadow. You're staying with me. The heavy oak doors of Suite 99 clicked shut with a finality that echoed in Danielle's chest. The silence of the penthouse was a far cry from the clattering dishes and shouting cooks of the hotel kitchen. Here, the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch, a suffocating luxury that felt more like a tomb than a retreat. Danielle stood in the center of the vast living room, her waitress uniform wrinkled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned toward the doors, her fingers trembling as she grasped the gold-plated handles. They didn't budge. She pulled harder, desperation clawing at her throat, but the electronic lock glowed a steady, mocking red. Looking for a way out. Kyung-ho's voice was a low vibration that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. He was sitting in a leather armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights of Seoul glittering behind him like a fallen galaxy. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a king, swirling a glass of amber liquid, his dark eyes tracking her every move. You can't keep me here, Danielle said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at defiance. My sister, she's waiting for me. If I don't show up, people will notice. Kyung-ho stood up, his movements fluid and predatory. He walked toward her, the distance between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his tailored suit. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers grazed the collar of her uniform, straightening it with terrifying gentleness. Your sister is being taken care of, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. And as for people noticing, in this hotel I am the only one who has ever noticed. To the world, you've simply finished your shift and moved on. Danielle pushed past him, running toward the balcony doors. If she could just reach the terrace, she could scream for help. She threw the glass doors open, the cold night air hitting her face, but she stopped dead. Two men in sharp black suits stood like statues on either side of the railing, their earpieces glinting in the moonlight. They didn't even look at her. They simply stepped inward, blocking her path with a wall of muscle. She spun around, scanning the room for a phone, a tool, anything. But every exit was a dead end. The service elevator required a biometric scan. The windows were reinforced, unbreakable glass. The wrong door hadn't just led her to a crime scene, it had led her into a fortress. Kyung-ho watched her realization dawn with a faint, chilling smile. This is your world now, Danielle, secure, silent, and mine. He stepped closer, his hand coming to rest possessively on her shoulder, his thumb stroking the base of her neck. Danielle shivered, trapped between the cold glass of the balcony and the burning heat of the man who refused to let her go. The heavy oak door of the penthouse suite clicked shut, a sound that resonated like a gavel in the silence. Danielle stood by the window, her reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of the glittering city she was no longer allowed to walk through. Behind her, Choi Kyung-ho sat at a dark mahogany desk, the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He was staring at a charred scrap of paper, a fragment recovered from the trader's briefcase, his brow furrowed in a rare display of frustration. It's useless, Kyung-ho muttered, his voice a low grade of gravel. The sequence is incomplete. Without the middle 6 digits, the ledger remains a brick. He crumpled the paper, the sound of parchment snapping under his strength. Danielle turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered that paper. She had seen it for less than 3 seconds when she had first burst into the room, scattered among the chaos on the floor before the cleaners had swept the suite. 749, she said softly. Kyung-ho's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing into lethal slits. What did you say? 749202, Danielle repeated, stepping closer into the pool of golden lamplight. Her voice trembled, but her mind was crystal clear, a perfect snapshot of the floor as it had looked 48 hours ago. It was written in blue ink, slanted to the left. It was tucked under the leg of the chair. Kyung-ho smoothed out the crumpled scrap, his gaze darting between the fragment and the woman standing before him. He punched the numbers into an encrypted laptop. The screen flickered, a red progress bar turning a vivid, triumphant green as the drive decrypted. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a new, terrifying energy. He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't stop until he was inches from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He reached out, his large hand cupping her jaw with a grip that was surprisingly steady, not to hurt, but to possess. I thought you were just a witness I had to hide, he whispered, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by something far more dangerous, fascination. But you're a map, Danielle. You've seen things you didn't even know were important. Danielle swallowed hard, the heat of his palm seeping into her skin. She saw the shift in his expression. The way he looked at her wasn't just as a captive anymore, but as a prize. You aren't leaving this room. Kyung-ho growled, his voice dropping an octave as he pulled her closer, his chest a solid wall against her. Not because of what you saw, but because of what you remember. You are the only one who can unlock my empire, and I don't share my keys. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse dressing room swung open, revealing a space that felt more like a museum of high-end weaponry and silk. Danielle felt the rough calluses of Choi Kyung-ho's hand against her lower back, a touch that was both a shield and a shackle. "The waitress died in Suite 99, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that grazed her ear. "Tonight, the world meets the woman who holds the Shadow King's heart." A team of silent, stone-faced stylists descended upon her. Danielle wanted to protest, to scream that her sister was waiting for a phone call that would never come, but every time she met Choi Kyung-ho's gaze in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, the words died in her throat. He watched her with a predatory stillness, nursing a glass of dark whiskey while the simple black-and-white cotton of her uniform was stripped away. In its place came a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, slashed high at the thigh to reveal the grace of her stride. But it wasn't enough for him. Choi Kyung-ho stood, the ice clinking in his glass, and walked toward her. From a velvet-lined box, he withdrew a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds. They were cold against her skin, a heavy collar of fire and ice. As he reached around to fasten the clasp, his fingers lingered on the nape of her neck, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Why the diamonds?" she whispered, her reflection unrecognizable. "They're too bright, people will look." "That is the point," Choi Kyung-ho replied, spinning her around to face him. He caught her chin, forcing her to look at the man who had effectively kidnapped her. "My enemies expect a witness to hide in the shadows. They don't expect her to stand in the light, draped in my protection. If you look like a queen, they will hesitate to treat you like a target." "And if I can't play the part?" Choi Kyung-ho leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and danger overwhelming her senses. "You have a photographic memory, Danielle. Remember the way I look at you. Remember the way I touch you. If you flinch, we both bleed." He led her toward the grand elevator. When the doors opened to the marble lobby where his lieutenants stood waiting, the air turned to glass. The murmurs died instantly. Choi Kyung-ho didn't break his stride, pulling her flush against his side. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing with a terrifying authority that brooked no question. "This is Danielle Monroe, my fiancée. Anyone who looks at her without my permission loses their eyes. Anyone who touches her loses their life." Danielle felt the weight of 100 stares, but as Choi Kyung-ho's hand tightened possessively over her shoulder, she realized the flaw in her own heart. She was terrified of him, yet for the first time in her life, she felt truly invincible. The scent of white truffles and aged wagyu filled the private dining room, but Danielle couldn't swallow a single bite. Across the table, Choi Kyung-ho sat in terrifyingly sharp elegance, his tailored black suit absorbing the dim, amber glow of the crystal chandelier. He hadn't touched his wine. Instead, his dark eyes remained fixed on Danielle, watching the way her pulse throbbed against the diamonds he had forced her to wear. "Eat, Danielle," he commanded, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "A queen should not look as though she is starving." "I'm not a queen," she whispered, her fingers trembling against the heavy silver fork. "I'm a waitress in a stolen dress, waiting for the floor to fall out from under me." Choi Kyung-ho leaned forward, his dominant presence closing the space between them. "In this room, you are whatever I say you are. The world outside does not exist." But the world outside was already bleeding in. A sudden, sharp crack shattered the atmosphere, the sound of a silenced high-caliber round piercing the reinforced glass window. The chandelier groaned, crystals raining down like jagged tears. Before Danielle could even scream, Choi Kyung-ho moved with a predatory speed that defied human reflex. He didn't dive for cover, he lunged across the table for her. His heavy, powerful frame slammed into hers, throwing them both to the marble floor. Danielle gasped as the wind was knocked out of her, her face pressed against the cool silk of his lapel. "Stay down," he hissed. Another round whistled through the air, thudding into the mahogany chair where Danielle had been sitting a second ago. The room erupted into chaos as Choi Kyung-ho's hidden security detail returned fire, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed weapons echoing off the walls. Danielle felt a sudden, sickening warmth spreading across her hands. She looked down, expecting to see her own blood, but her white uniform was being stained by a deep, spreading crimson coming from Choi Kyung-ho's shoulder. A jagged shard of glass or a grazing bullet had torn through his suit. "You're hurt," she choked out, her savior complex instantly overriding her terror. She reached up, her fingers pressing against the wound to staunch the flow. "Choi Kyung-ho, you're bleeding." He didn't flinch. Even with blood soaking his shirt, his expression remained disturbingly calm, his eyes locked on the door as he shielded her body with his own. He looked down at her, his hand moving to rest possessively on her head, pressing her closer to his chest. "It's just a scratch," he growled, though his breath hitched. "I told you, Danielle, I don't let anyone take what belongs to me." In that moment, amidst the smell of gunpowder and expensive perfume, the dynamic shifted. She saw the monster's vulnerability, and he saw the waitress's fire. The witness protocol had just become a blood bond. The heavy oak door of the penthouse suite clicked shut, sealing out the chaotic whispers of the syndicate's cleanup crew. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive iron-filtered air and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Choi Kyung-ho sat rigidly on the edge of a velvet armchair, his silk shirt discarded on the floor. A jagged graze from a 9-round marred the porcelain perfection of his shoulder, the crimson liquid staining his hand as he tried to stem the flow. Danielle stood by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Just hours ago, she was worrying about late table service. Now she was staring at the vulnerability of a god. Despite the fear paralyzing her joints, her savior complex acted faster than her common sense. She didn't run for the window, she ran for the bathroom. She returned with a basin of warm water, clean towels, and a first aid kit she'd scavenged from the vanity. When she knelt between his knees, Choi Kyung-ho's hand shot out, his fingers bruising her wrist as he pinned her in place. His dark eyes were blown wide, feral with the adrenaline of the ambush. "I didn't give you permission to touch me," he rasped, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "You're going to bleed out on this expensive rug if you don't let me help," Danielle countered, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "I spent 3 years volunteering at the free clinic back home. I've seen worse than this, Mr. Choi. Now let go." The silence stretched, a high-tension wire ready to snap. Slowly, his grip loosened. Danielle didn't waste a second. She dipped a cloth into the water and began to dab at the wound. As the warmth hit his skin, she felt a shudder ripple through his massive frame. The Shadow King wasn't made of stone. He was warm, pulsing, and currently in pain. As she worked, the silence shifted from hostile to intimate. The golden glow of the city lights filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across them. Danielle leaned in close, her breath ghosting over his skin. She applied the antiseptic with a feather-light touch, her fingers steady despite the proximity. Choi Kyung-ho watched her, not with the predatory gaze of a boss, but with a look of profound, confused curiosity. No one touched him without an agenda, no one saw him bleed without dying for it. Yet here was this waitress, her simple uniform stained with his blood, treating him as if he were just another soul worth saving. When she finally pressed the bandage into place, her palm lingered on his shoulder for a fraction of a second too long. Choi Kyung-ho reached up, his hand covering hers, pressing it firmer against his heart. For the first time, the mask slipped, and Danielle saw the exhaustion behind the ruthlessness. "Why aren't you running?" he whispered. "I think we both know," she replied softly, meeting his gaze, "that you wouldn't let me get very far." The opulent gold leaf on the dining room ceiling felt like a cage to Danielle as she sat across from Choi Young-bi. Kyung-ho sat beside her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone in a way that felt both like a caress and a warning. Itzingba, Kyung-ho's uncle, swirled a vintage Bordeaux, his eyes narrowed into predatory slits as he studied Dinpol's every move. He didn't see a mafia queen. He smelled the scent of cheap dish soap and exhaustion hidden beneath her Chanel perfume. "My nephew has always had a penchant for the exotic," Itzingba drawled, his voice like sandpaper on silk. "But I find it curious, Dinpol. The Monroe family of Savannah is well known in textile circles, yet I don't recall a daughter with your particular radiance. Where exactly did you attend finishing school?" Dinpol felt a cold sweat prickle her spine. This was the moment Kyung-ho had warned her about. Her savior complex urged her to look down, to yield, but she remembered the stakes. Her sister's life depended on this lie. She leaned back, channeling the cold steel she had seen in Kyung-ho's eyes. I find it equally curious, Mr. Cha, that a man of your stature spends his dinner hour playing genealogist instead of discussing the port expansion, Dinpul replied, her voice steady. Perhaps the textiles weren't interesting enough to keep your attention. Itzingba's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sharp, but diamonds don't hide the calluses on a girl's hands. He suddenly reached across the table, grabbing Dinpul's wrist and flipping her palm upward. Before Kyung-ho could react, Itzingba pointed to a faint, silver scar on her thumb, a burn from a kitchen steamer. This isn't from a polo mallet, is it? It looks like the mark of a servant. The air in the room turned frigid. Kyung-ho's grip on her shoulder tightened, his other hand moving toward the silenced pistol tucked into his waistband. The silence was a ticking bomb. That scar, Dinpul said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, is from a chemistry lab explosion during my residency. I prefer saving lives to social climbing. Is that a problem for the syndicate? Kyung-ho let out a dark, low chuckle that vibrated through Dinpul's body. He leaned forward, the shadow of the Shadow King falling over the table. My uncle is getting old, Dinpul. He confuses hard work with low status. If you touch her again, uncle, I'll ensure you never have to worry about anyone's hands ever again. Itzingba pulled back, sensing the lethal shift in the room. He raised his glass in a mock toast, but his gaze remained fixed on Dinpul. He knew she was a fraud, and Dinpul knew that from this moment on, she wasn't just a guest, she was a target. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Seoul skyline shimmering like a bruised jewel against the black velvet of the night. Inside the armored mubuk, the silence was no longer heavy with threat, but with an electric, unspoken curiosity. Dinpul watched the reflection of the neon lights dance across Kyung-ho's sharp profile. For the first time since she had stumbled into Suite 99, he wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the haunting ink of a dragon that disappeared beneath his cuff, and for a moment, he looked less like a monster and more like a man. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her hand instinctively touching the silk of the dress he had chosen for her, a deep emerald that made her skin glow. "To see the foundation of an empire," Kyung-ho replied, his voice a low hum that vibrated in the small space. "You think my world is built on bullets, Dinpul. Tonight I will show you the stone." The car pulled up not to a skyscraper, but to a quiet, traditional hanok tucked away in a hidden alley of Bukshun. An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of a century lived, stood waiting at the wooden gate. To Dinpul's shock, the ruthless Shadow King bowed deeply, a gesture of genuine, humble respect. "This is Mrs. Park," Kyung-ho said, his hand resting possessively yet gently on the small of Dinpul's back. "Her husband took a blade meant for my father 30 years ago. In this world, we do not forget." The night unfolded in a blur of warmth and ancient tradition. They sat on floor mats, eating home-cooked juk and spicy octopus. There were no bodyguards in the room, no talk of ledgers or digital codes. Instead, Kyung-ho listened as the woman scolded him for working too hard, his cold eyes softening in a way that made Dinpul's heart skip a beat. Later, as they walked through the courtyard under the moonlight, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Dinpul looked at him, her savior complex warring with her fear. "You take care of all of them, don't you? The families of the men you've lost." Kyung-ho stopped, turning her to face him. The shadows of the eaves fell across his face, highlighting the intensity of his gaze. "Loyalty is the only currency that doesn't devalue, Dinpul. My enemies think I keep you because you saw too much. They are wrong." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than his gun. "I keep you because you are the only person who looked at the blood on my hands and still tried to check my pulse." In that quiet moment, the lines between captive and protector blurred. Dinpul realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just staying for her sister anymore. She was staying for the man who hid a heart of gold beneath a shroud of shadows. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered with a clinical coldness that made Dinpul's skin crawl. She had just tucked the thin thermal blanket around her sister's shoulders, whispering promises of a brighter future, when a heavy hand clamped onto her elbow. Before she could gasp, she was pulled into the shadow of a vacant stairwell. "You're a hard woman to find, Dinpal, or should I say the future Mrs. Cha." The voice was like gravel under a boot. Detective Miller stood there, his badge glinting mockingly in the dim light. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had spent too many years breathing in the rot of the city. He didn't wait for her to speak. He shoved a manila folder into her chest, the sharp corners digging into her ribs. "Inside that folder is your sister's medical file." Miller leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee and nicotine. "And right next to it is a report on your father's accidental death. You think Kyung-ho is your savior. He's the reason people like you stay in the dirt. He's a monster, Dinpal. And I'm the only one who can keep you from being swallowed whole." Dinpal felt the familiar, suffocating weight of her savior complex. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of defiance. "I'm just a waitress, detective. I don't know what you think I can do." Miller laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Don't play dumb. You've seen his ledgers. You've seen the names. You have that freakish memory of yours. Use it. I want the offshore account numbers and the names of the board members he's bribing. Give me the Shadow King, and your sister gets moved to the top of the transplant list tomorrow. Everything paid for. No questions asked." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. "But if you refuse, I'll have this hospital clear her bed by morning. She'll be on the street, and you'll be in a cell for accessory to murder. You have 48 hours to decide whose life matters more, the man who bought you diamonds or the sister who shares your blood." He let go of her arm, leaving a red mark that throbbed in time with her pulse. As Miller vanished back into the hallway, Dinpal looked through the small glass window of the stairwell door. She saw her sister, frail and sleeping, and then she saw the two black-suited men Kyung-ho had stationed at the end of the hall. She was trapped between two devils, one who held her heart in a gilded cage and one who held her future over a flame. For the first time, her photographic memory felt like a curse. She could see every possible ending, and in all of them, someone had to bleed. The golden light of the penthouse filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but Dinpal didn't feel the warmth. For 3 days, she had been staring at the encrypted files Kyung-ho had retrieved from a blood-stained drive. To the Mafia, it was a wall of gibberish. To her, it was a pattern, a familiar rhythm of numbers that matched the inventory logs she used to memorize at the hotel to keep her tips straight. Kyung-ho stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city skyline. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom on the brink of war. "My decoders have been working on this for months, Dinpal," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If you're wasting my time, the protection contract ends tonight." Dinpal didn't look up. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her photographic memory pulling up images of shipping manifests she'd glimpsed months ago. "Your decoders were looking for passwords," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They should have been looking for coordinates." With a final, decisive keystroke, the screen flickered. The wall of random characters collapsed, rebuilding itself into a neat, terrifying map of the city's underground arteries. Names, bank accounts, and the exact locations of the rival syndicate's hidden vaults spilled across the monitor in glowing green text. Kyung-ho was at her side in an instant. His large hand gripped the back of her chair, his sudden proximity sending a jolt of electricity through her. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the data with a predatory intensity. "This isn't just a ledger," he breathed, his thumb grazing the pulse point on her neck. "This is the blueprint for their entire empire." He looked down at her, and for the first time, the coldness in his gaze was replaced by something else, a dark, possessive spark of admiration. He realized then that the girl he had snatched from a hotel room wasn't just a witness. She was the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. "You've just signed the death warrants of every man who stands against me," Kyung-ho said, his voice dropping to a gravelly silk. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "But you've also made yourself the most hunted woman in this city. Every street gang and corrupt cop will want your head for what's in your brain." Danielle looked into his dark eyes, realizing the stakes had shifted. She was no longer just a waitress in a gilded cage. She was the key to the city, and the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave was the ruthless man who refused to let her go. "Then you better make sure your protection is worth 100 million, she challenged, her voice trembling but defiant. Kyung-ho's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "I'll do better than that, Danielle. I'll make them regret ever looking at what belongs to me." The silence in the penthouse was heavy, suffocating like the humid air before a thunderstorm. Danielle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a ghost against the glittering skyline of Seoul. In her pocket, the small, cold weight of the wire felt like a ticking bomb. Detective Miller's voice echoed in her head. "Record him confessing to the shipyard deal, or your sister loses her spot on the transplant list." The heavy mahogany doors creaked open. Kyung-ho walked in, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattooed ink snaking down his forearms. He didn't look like a monster tonight. He looked weary. He stopped just inches behind her, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. "The city looks peaceful from here," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her spine. "But look closer, Danielle. It's a graveyard of people who made the wrong choices." Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs. "Why are you telling me this?" Kyung-ho didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his waistband and pulled out his sleek, matte black semi-automatic. Danielle gasped, stepping back, but he didn't point it at her. Instead, he laid it flat on the marble coffee table. Next to it, he placed a small, crushed electronic device. Her breath hitched. It was the wire. "I found this in your jacket while you were sleeping," he said, his tone terrifyingly calm. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. "Miller is a small man with small threats. He thinks he can use a waitress to take down a king." Danielle's eyes filled with tears. "He has my sister, Kyung-ho. I didn't have a choice." "There is always a choice." Kyung-ho stepped closer, picking up the heavy gun. He didn't aim it. He turned it around, holding it by the barrel, and pressed the cold metal grip into Danielle's trembling palm. "This is the loyalty test, Danielle. You have the wire and now you have the lead. If you want to be free of me, if you want to take Miller's deal, pull the trigger. I won't stop you." The weight of the weapon was immense. Danielle looked from the gun to the man who had kidnapped her, protected her, and hidden her from a world that wanted her dead. His dark eyes were unblinking, offering her his life as if it were a common gift. The air in the room crackled. She could end it all now. The fear, the captivity, the luxury that felt like a shroud. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a mafia boss. She saw the only person who had ever truly looked at her and seen a queen instead of a servant. With a sob, Danielle let the gun clatter to the floor. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the recording device, and dropped it into a glass of whiskey sitting on the table. The electronics hissed and died. Kyung-ho's expression didn't change, but his hand reached out, cupping her face with a possessiveness that made her knees weak. "Wrong choice for the world," he whispered, pulling her flush against his chest. "But the right choice for me. You're mine now, Danielle. Miller can't have you. The law can't have you. Only the shadow." The heavy humidity of the late-night rain clung to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, mirroring the suffocating tension inside. Danielle stood in the center of the dark office, the small, cold weight of a wiretap nestled in her palm. It was a silver sliver of betrayal, provided by Detective Miller with a promise of safety that felt more like a threat. Kyung-ho sat behind his mahogany desk, the amber glow of a single lamp casting long, predatory shadows across his sharp features. He didn't look at her. He was cleaning a sleek black handgun with a rhythmic, terrifying calmness. "Miller thinks I'm a monster, Danielle," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that skipped across her skin. "And he's right. But a monster keeps his word. He promised you a way out. I'm promising you a way up." Danielle looked at the man who had held her captive, yet had been the only one to shield her from the vultures circling her sister's hospital bed. She thought of the witness protocol, the assassins in the hallway, and the way Kyung-ho's hand had felt on her shoulder. Possessive, yes, but steady. "If I turn this on," she whispered, her voice trembling but gaining strength, "you lose everything." Kyung-ho finally looked up. His dark eyes weren't filled with the rage she expected, but a haunting curiosity. He stood slowly, walking around the desk until he was inches away, the scent of expensive sandalwood and metallic gun oil enveloping her. He reached out, not to take the wire, but to tilt her chin up. "And if you don't, you become an accomplice to a devil. There is no middle ground in my world, Danielle. You are either with me or you are a memory." The silence stretched, thick and crystalline. Danielle looked at the wire, the symbol of her old life, her fear, and the law that had never once protected her neighborhood. Then she looked at the man who had rewritten her destiny in a single night. With a sudden, sharp movement, she dropped the device onto the marble floor. Before Kyung-ho could react, she raised her heavy heel and crushed it. The sound of plastic snapping echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She ground the remains into the stone until it was nothing but useless electronic dust. Kyung-ho's breath hitched. For the first time, the Shadow King looked stunned. Danielle stepped closer, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a new, fierce light. "The detective doesn't care about my sister," she said, her voice dropping to a defiant silk. "He wants a trophy. You want a partner. I'm choosing the devil I know." Kyung-ho's expression shifted from surprise to a dark, triumphant hunger. He pulled her into him, his hand tangling in her hair with a grip that signaled she was never, ever letting go. "Then welcome to the darkness, Danielle Monroe," he murmured against her lips. "I'll make sure you're the most powerful thing in it." The chandelier-drenched ballroom of the Grand Metropole was a sea of silk and deception. Danielle felt the weight of the 5-carat diamond necklace against her throat, a glittering collar that reminded her she was Kyung-ho's most precious asset and his greatest vulnerability. Every eye in the room, from corrupt politicians to high society vultures, was fixed on the beautiful woman on the arm of the Shadow King. "Breathe," Kyung-ho whispered, his hand firm and possessive on the small of her back. His tailored suit was a sharp contrast to the predatory stillness of his expression. "You aren't just a waitress tonight, Danielle. You are the woman who holds the codes to the city. Look at them like they're the ones who should be afraid." She leaned into him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I see your uncle," she murmured, her photographic memory instantly flagging Choi Kyung-ho near the champagne fountain. "He's not drinking. He's checking his watch every 30 seconds. Kyung-ho's jaw tightened. Then the play begins. The shift in the room was instantaneous. A waiter dropped a tray of crystal flutes, the same sound that had started this nightmare weeks ago. But this time, it wasn't an accident. It was a signal. The grand double doors were kicked open, and the shattering of glass was followed by the staccato roar of automatic gunfire. Chaos erupted. The elite scrambled over one another, screams piercing the classical music that had yet to stop playing. Kyung-ho didn't hesitate. He pulled Danielle behind a marble pillar, shielding her body with his own. "Stay low," he commanded, drawing his weapon with a lethal fluidity. "Kyung-ho, the balcony," Danielle shouted, her eyes darting to the floor plan she had memorized from the hotel's blueprints. "If they flank the stairs, we're trapped. There's a service lift behind the velvet curtains. It's the only way out that isn't rigged." A bullet chipped the marble inches from Kyung-ho's head. He looked at her, a dark flash of pride crossing his features despite the carnage. He knew then that she wasn't just a victim he was protecting. She was the strategist he needed to survive. Just as they made a break for the curtains, a deafening explosion rocked the ballroom. The floor buckled, and the massive center chandelier groaned, its chains snapping one by one. Danielle looked up in horror as tons of crystal began to plummet. Kyung-ho lunged, throwing his entire weight into her to shove her clear of the impact zone. The world turned to dust and white light. As the smoke cleared, Danielle coughed, her vision swimming. She reached out through the debris, her hand brushing against Kyung-ho's sleeve. He was pinned beneath a heavy beam, his blood staining the white marble floor. "Go," he gasped, his eyes fixed on the shadows where his uncle's men were approaching. "Danielle, run." But Danielle Monroe didn't run. She looked at the gun that had slid across the floor toward her, then at the man who had risked everything to save her, and she realized the savior in her wasn't ready to let him go. The sirens in the distance were nothing compared to the roar of the fire currently consuming the hotel's east wing. Danielle stood on the rain-slicked balcony, her fingers trembling as they clutched the burner phone Miller had forced into her hand. Across the room, Choi Kyung-ho was a silhouette of lethal grace, barking orders into his radio, his back turned to her for the first time in weeks. He trusted her. That was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. "Do it now, or the ICU power goes out," Miller's voice crackled through the receiver, cold and thin. "Your sister has 10 minutes of oxygen left. If you don't hand him the drive and walk toward the south exit, she's dead before the explosion even hits." Danielle's heart felt like it was being crushed by a cold hand. She looked at the small silver drive on the table, the one containing the syndicate's offshore accounts. If she gave it to Choi Kyung-ho's uncle, Young-bi, Choi Kyung-ho would lose his empire. If she didn't, she would lose her soul. Choi Kyung-ho turned, his dark eyes softening as they landed on her. "Danielle, the car is ready. We're getting you out of here." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to stroke her cheek, a gesture of rare, terrifying tenderness. "I can't go with you," she whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She picked up the drive, holding it like a weapon. "I'm done being your prisoner, Choi Kyung-ho." His expression didn't shatter, it froze. A chilling, mechanical stillness settled over him. "What are you doing?" "I'm saving myself," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "Miller offered me a way out. My sister is already safe. I gave them the codes 10 minutes ago." The air in the room turned arctic. Choi Kyung-ho's hand dropped to his side, his knuckles turning white. "You're lying, you wouldn't." "Look at the screen, Choi Kyung-ho." As she spoke, the monitors in his command center flickered. A remote bypass was wiping his servers. It was Miller's work, but it looked like hers. A deafening boom rocked the floor below. The glass windows shattered inward, a curtain of fire rising from the street. Through the smoke, Danielle saw the heartbreak beneath Choi Kyung-ho's fury, a look of profound, soul-deep betrayal. "Go!" she screamed as another explosion shook the building. She turned and ran toward the flames of the south exit, tears streaming down her face. To save his life, she had to make him hate her. As the roof began to groan and collapse, she looked back one last time. Choi Kyung-ho stood amidst the falling debris, a fallen king watching his world, and his heart burned to the ground. The smell of smoke hit Danielle before the heat did, a bitter chemical stench that choked the air in the luxury corridor. The alarm was a distant, rhythmic scream, but the roar of the fire in the east wing was louder, a predatory growl that promised no survivors. "Choi Kyung-ho!" Danielle's voice was a ragged whisper as she pounded on the reinforced glass of the gallery. Through the haze, she saw him. He was a silhouette of controlled fury, pinned down by Young-bi's men near the main vault. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the cold Shadow King was gone. In his eyes was a raw, agonizing command. "Run." But Danielle couldn't move. Her savior complex held her captive. She saw the shadow of a hitman rising behind Choi Kyung-ho, a glint of steel aimed at his back. "No!" she screamed, lunging toward the door just as a massive explosion ripped through the ceiling. The floor buckled. Shards of crystal from the chandeliers rained down like lethal diamonds. Danielle felt a pair of rough, gloved hands snatch her backward just as the corridor collapsed into a wall of orange flame. "Let me go. He's still in there," she fought, her nails digging into the arms of the man holding her. "The boss's orders, Miss Monroe," a low, familiar voice grunted. It was Jin, Choi Kyung-ho's most loyal shadow. "To the world, you died in this room. If you stay, Young-bi wins. If you disappear, the boss has a reason to burn it all down." Outside, the night sky was stained red. Fire trucks raced toward the hotel, their sirens wailing in a futile chorus. From the blacked-out van idling in the alleyway, Danielle watched through the tinted glass as the entire 99th floor turned into a funeral pyre. She saw the silhouette of her own waitress uniform, discarded in the chaos, shrivel into ash against a window pane. Her heart felt as though it were being crushed in Choi Kyung-ho's possessive grip one last time. She had entered that hotel a girl looking for a way out. She was leaving it as a ghost with a debt of blood. As the van sped away into the darkness, Jin handed her a burner phone and a new passport. "The boss said to tell you, wait for the sunrise. I'll find you in the light." Danielle gripped the passport, her knuckles white, her tears drying in the heat of the receding fire. The waitress was dead. And as the city lights flickered by, she realized she wasn't just running. She was preparing for the day she would return to take it all back. For 730 days, the world believed Danielle Monroe was nothing more than ash and a tragic headline. In the coastal sprawl of Marseille, far from the neon-choked alleys of Seoul, the woman who had been a preyed-upon waitress was systematically dismantled and rebuilt. She didn't just survive the fire, she forged herself in it. Using the offshore accounts Choi Kyung-ho's loyalists had funneled to her, Danielle didn't hide, she invested. She traded her waitress uniform for sharp-shouldered blazers and her fear for a cold, calculating brilliance. Her photographic memory, once a survival tool for a mafia boss's codes, became her greatest weapon in the high-stakes world of international shipping and logistics. She moved like a phantom through European boardrooms, acquiring the very companies that supplied the Choi syndicate's rivals. She wasn't just building a life, she was building an army of ledgers and legal deeds. Every sleepless night spent studying market fluctuations was fueled by the memory of Choi Kyung-ho's hand on her shoulder, the weight of a protection that had almost cost him everything. Meanwhile, back in the heart of the Shadow Syndicate, Choi Kyung-ho had become a legend of grief. The Shadow King was now a ghost boss. He rarely left the penthouse of Suite 99, the air there still thick with the ghostly scent of the vanilla oil Danielle used to wear. His ruthlessness had turned into a hollow, mechanical efficiency. He broke his enemies not for power, but because he felt nothing else. His uncle, Youngbi, whispered that the boss had lost his mind to a dead girl, but no one dared challenge him. Choi Kyung-ho's eyes were darker than they had ever been, reflecting a soul that had stopped looking for the light. He sat in the dark, nursing a glass of scotch, staring at a small, charred silver tray he had recovered from the ruins of the fire. He didn't know that across the ocean, Danielle was standing on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, closing a deal that would make her the majority shareholder of the very port his syndicate relied on. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Gone was the disheveled girl with the terrified eyes. In her place stood a woman with a gaze as lethal as a bared blade. She touched the empty space on her ring finger, a silent promise echoing in her mind. The 2 years of silence were over. The waitress was dead, but the queen was coming home to claim her king. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of cold silk and predatory ambition. Choi Kyung-ho sat in the center of the front row, his presence a dark anchor in the room. 2 years had hollowed him out. The Shadow King was now a man of jagged edges and silent grief, his eyes never straying from the stage, yet seeing nothing at all. He was there for the Blue Dragon ledger, the final piece of his rival Youngbi's empire. He didn't want the power. He wanted to burn it all down in memory of the woman he had lost to the flames. "Current bid, $40 million from the Choi Syndicate," the auctioneer's voice rang out, echoing against the gilded ceiling. Youngbi smirked from across the aisle, confident. No one in Seoul dared to outbid the man who held the city's throat. $50 million. The voice was cool, melodic, and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. It didn't come from the local tycoons. It came from the shadows of the VIP balcony. Choi Kyung-ho's heart, a frozen organ he thought had died 2 years ago, gave a violent, painful thud. He didn't turn around, he couldn't. That tone, that cadence, it was a ghost's echo. $60 million, Youngbi snapped, his face reddening. $100 million. The room gasped. The auctioneer's gavel hovered, trembling. $100 million, going once, twice. Choi Kyung-ho stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He turned, his gaze climbing the velvet stairs to the balcony. Stepping into the light was a woman who radiated a lethal, high-end elegance. She wasn't wearing a waitress's uniform or the diamonds he had once forced upon her. She wore a tailored midnight blue power suit, her natural hair styled in a sophisticated crown. She looked down at the elite of Seoul not with fear, but with the weary patience of a queen looking at pawns. "Sold, to the CEO of Monroe International," the auctioneer shouted. Danielle Monroe didn't look at the stage. She looked straight at Choi Kyung-ho. The shock in the room was palpable. A black woman had just dismantled the city's most powerful men in a single minute. She began to descend the stairs, the rhythmic click of her heels sounding like a countdown. Youngbi's guards moved to intercept her, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Choi Kyung-ho, whose breath was ragged, his hands clenched at his sides. As she reached the floor, she stopped inches from him. The scent of her perfume, the same jasmine he had smelled in the rain 2 years ago, hit him like a physical blow. "I heard the Shadow King was losing his grip," she whispered, her voice a sill-crapped blade. She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of his suit, echoing the way he used to claim her. "I didn't come back for the ledger, Choi Kyung-ho. I came back to see if you were still worth saving." The penthouse office of the Choi Syndicate was a tomb of glass and steel, overlooking a city that still bled the same neon blue as the night Danielle died. Choi Kyung-ho sat in the shadows, his hand trembling slightly as he swirled a glass of untouched whiskey. He had spent 730 days staring at the door, waiting for a ghost. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, it wasn't a ghost who walked in. The clicking of stilettos on the marble floor sounded like the cocking of a weapon. Danielle Monroe didn't look like a girl who had ever carried a room service tray. She wore a tailored power suit the color of midnight, her hair styled in a sharp, regal cut that framed a face hardened by fire and ambition. The fear that once defined her wide eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating brilliance that mirrored his own. Choi Kyung-ho stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor like a terminal groan. He moved toward her, his breath hitching as he stepped into the light. He wanted to reach out, to see if she would shatter into ash under his touch, but he stopped inches away, trapped by the sheer gravity of her presence. "I watched the hotel wing collapse, Danielle," he rasped, his voice raw with a grief he had never allowed himself to speak. "I searched the rubble until my hands bled. I thought I buried you." Danielle didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume, something expensive, sharp, and unfamiliar, filling his senses. She reached up, her fingers grazing the lapel of his suit, not in a gesture of affection but of ownership. "You did bury her, Choi Kyung-ho," she whispered, her voice a smooth blade. "You buried the terrified waitress who was afraid of the dark. You buried the girl who thought she needed a monster to protect her." She stepped back, her silhouette framed against the sprawling skyline she now sought to conquer. A thin, dangerous smile played on her lips as she looked at the man who had once been her captor. "But you forgot one thing about the earth you threw over me," she said, her eyes flashing with a lethal, newfound power. "It was fertile. I didn't just survive the fire, Choi Kyung-ho. I consumed it. I'm not your witness anymore. I'm the queen now, and I've come to take my throne." The silence that followed was no longer a tomb. It was a battlefield. Choi Kyung-ho looked at the woman before him and realized with a surge of terrifying pride that he was no longer looking at his greatest liability. He was looking at the only person capable of destroying him. The air inside the abandoned harbor warehouse was thick with the scent of salt and ozone, a storm brewing both outside and within. Choi Youngbi stood flanked by a dozen armed men, a smug sneer curling his lips as he looked at the two figures standing in the spotlight of the overhead industrial lamps. He thought he had trapped a wounded lion and a defenseless bird. He didn't realize he was facing a god of war and a grandmaster of strategy. "You should have stayed dead, Danielle," Youngbi spat, signaling his men to level their rifles. "And you, Choi Kyung-ho, you've grown soft, trading an empire for a waitress." Choi Kyung-ho's expression didn't flicker. He stood like a monolith in his charcoal suit, his hand resting possessively on Danielle's shoulder. "I didn't trade my empire, uncle," he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "I just found its true architect." Danielle stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. In her tailored white silk power suit, she looked like a storm incarnate. She held up a small, unassuming tablet. "You think your accounts are secure because you change the encryption every hour, Youngbi? You forgot one thing." She tapped the screen, and the overhead monitors in the warehouse flickered to life, displaying Youngbi's private offshore transactions in real time. I saw your master key 2 years ago in Suite 99. I've had it memorized since the second I opened that door. As the numbers on the screen began to plummet to 0, Youngbi's face drained of color. What have you done? I've dismantled your funding, Danielle said, her voice cool and unwavering. Your men aren't loyal to you, they're loyal to your payroll. And as of 3 seconds ago, you're bankrupt. Confusion rippled through the gunmen. In that split second of hesitation, the brawn took over. Choi Kyung-ho moved with a speed that defied his heavy frame. He pulled a concealed firearm with fluid grace, his first 2 shots taking out the lights, plunging the warehouse into a rhythmic dance of muzzle flashes and shadows. Danielle didn't scream. She didn't hide. She moved through the darkness with a chilling calm, her photographic memory allowing her to navigate the crates and obstacles as if the lights were still on. She whispered directions into a comms link, guiding Choi Kyung-ho's loyal hidden snipers to every target she had mapped out before they even entered the building. When the lights finally hummed back to life, Youngbi was on his knees, surrounded by his own disarmed men. Choi Kyung-ho stood over him, the barrel of his gun pressed against his uncle's forehead. He looked back at Danielle, waiting for her word. Danielle walked over, looking down at the man who had tried to burn her alive. She didn't choose vengeance, she chose victory. The witness protocol is over, she said. Kill me then, Youngbi hissed. No, Choi Kyung-ho growled, his eyes softening only when they landed on Danielle. I have something much worse for you. You're going to watch us build a new world on the ruins of yours. The heavy, mahogany doors of the syndicate's inner sanctum swung open, but the men waiting inside didn't see a ghost. They saw their replacement. Choi Kyung-ho walked with a rhythmic, lethal grace, his hand resting firmly on the small of Danielle Monroe's back. She was no longer in a disheveled waitress uniform. She wore a tailored midnight blue power suit that shimmered like the city lights from Suite 99. The air in the room chilled. The elders, men who had spent decades trading in blood and shadows, looked at Danielle's calm, piercing gaze and realized the witness had become the judge. The era of the Shadow Syndicate ends tonight, Choi Kyung-ho's voice rang out, devoid of the jagged edge of his youth, replaced by a terrifying, absolute authority. He pulled out a chair for Danielle at the head of the long table, a seat once reserved for his murderous uncle, Youngbi. From this hour, every asset, every port, and every ledger under the Choi name is being absorbed by Monroe Choi Global. We are no longer in the business of fear. We are in the business of the future. A low murmur of dissent rose from the back, but Danielle didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the golden light of the chandelier catching the diamond on her finger, the same finger that had once trembled while holding a room service tray. I've memorized every offshore account you've hidden, she said, her voice a smooth, dangerous silk. I've tracked every shipment and every bribe. You can either sign the transition papers and retire with your lives, or you can test if my husband's mercy has improved over the last 2 years. I assure you, it hasn't. Choi Kyung-ho looked down at her, his cold, obsidian eyes softening only for her. He remembered the terrified girl he had pulled into his arms to hide her from assassins. Now she was the one shielding him with her brilliant mind and unyielding spirit. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear in a possessive ghost of a kiss. They're afraid of you, Danielle, he whispered. Good, she replied, reaching up to adjust his silk tie. They should be. By dawn, the transformation was complete. The blood-stained ledgers were burned, replaced by digital transparent contracts. The Shadow King had stepped out of the darkness, led by the woman who had opened the wrong door only to find the right throne. As they stood on the balcony overlooking the waking city, the sun rising over the hospital Danielle had saved and the empire they had rebuilt, Choi Kyung-ho refused to let her go. He held her tight, a silent vow that while the world had changed, his obsession never would. Danielle opened the wrong door and found a love that was written in the stars and sealed in blood. If you want to see more stories of ruthless protectors and the women who tame them, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our next gripping romance. Who would you choose? The hero or the boss? Let us know in the comments below.